On a cold winter morning in 1865, in a grand palace in London, a baby boy was born who would change the face of the British royal family forever. His name was George Frederick Ernest Albert, and he came into the world as the second son of the Prince of Wales. Nobody expected this small baby to become king. In fact, most people thought he never would wear the crown at all. George was born into the house of Saxe-Coburg, a royal family with German roots that had ruled Britain for decades. George experienced real hardship and genuine challenges. At the age of 12, he was sent away from the comfort of royal homes to train as a naval officer. This was unusual for a prince, but it would prove to be the making of the future king. His grandmother was the famous Queen Victoria, who had been on the throne for nearly 30 years by the time George arrived. Albert Victor attended the finest schools, learned languages, and studied statecraft. Everything was planned for him to follow their father onto the throne when the time came. George remained happily in his shadow, content with his life at sea and his role as the supporting prince. She was the most powerful woman in the world, ruling over an empire so vast that people said the sun never set on British lands. In 1892, when George was 26 years old and serving as a dedicated naval officer, tragedy struck the royal family like lightning from a clear sky. Working people were demanding better conditions and more political power. Women were beginning to fight for the right to vote. New political ideas about socialism and workers' rights were spreading among the population. He could see that the old ways of being royal would not work in the modern world that was emerging. Kings could no longer rule simply because they were born to the throne. They would have to earn the respect and loyalty of their people through service, dedication, and genuine care for their welfare. The old ways of ruling, where kings and nobles made all the important decisions, were being questioned and challenged. Gone were his dreams of a simple life at sea, commanding ships and exploring distant lands. Queen Victoria had arranged marriages for her children and grandchildren with princes and princesses from Germany, Russia, Denmark, and other kingdoms. This meant that George was cousin to the Kaiser of Germany, the Tsar of Russia, and many other European rulers. These family connections had helped keep peace in Europe for decades, but they were also becoming a source of tension and conflict. Instead, he faced a future filled with state ceremonies, political meetings, and the enormous responsibility of ruling over hundreds of millions of people across the globe. They spoke German at home, followed German customs, and maintained close ties with German relatives. This had never been a problem before, but as nationalism grew stronger across Europe, people in Britain were beginning to question whether their royal family was truly British at all. He would need to become not just a ruler, but a symbol of his nation's hopes and dreams. Little did anyone know that this unexpected king would make decisions that would reshape the British monarchy forever and create a new royal house that would endure for generations to come. The carefree naval officer had to transform himself into a future king, and he had to do it quickly. Prince Albert Victor, the heir to the throne after their father, suddenly fell ill with pneumonia. Within days, he was dead. The prince, who was never supposed to be king, suddenly found himself next in line to inherit the greatest throne in the world. But George was not meant to inherit all this power and responsibility. That job belonged to his older brother, Prince Albert Victor. George was what royal families called the spare heir. New technologies were connecting distant places in ways never imagined. It stretched across 6 continents and included nearly a quarter of all the people on Earth. British ships controlled the seas. British merchants dominated global trade, and British ideas about law, government, and civilization influenced societies around the world. But this vast empire was also becoming harder to manage and more expensive to maintain. The telephone, the telegraph, and new forms of transportation were making the world smaller, but also more complicated. Old empires were facing new challenges, and royal families across Europe were beginning to feel pressure from their people for more democracy and freedom. His role in life was simple: to support his brother, serve his country, and stay quietly in the background. These experiences taught him lessons that no palace tutor could provide. He learned the value of hard work, the importance of duty, and most importantly, he learned to understand and respect ordinary people. The young prince seemed perfectly happy with this arrangement. He saw the beaches of Australia, the mountains of South Africa, and the tropical islands of the Caribbean. These journeys opened his eyes to the incredible diversity of people and cultures under British rule. Unlike many royals who only knew Britain from their palace windows, George understood that the empire was made up of millions of different people with their own traditions and ways of life. He loved the sea ships and the adventure of naval life far more than the stuffy ceremonies and endless rules of royal palaces. As a child, George was different from other royal princes. While his cousins across Europe lived in golden cages of privilege, the young prince learned to climb tall masts in stormy weather, sleep in cramped quarters with common sailors, and take orders from men who cared nothing for his royal blood. George spent years sailing to distant corners of the British Empire. While George was learning seamanship and exploring the world, his older brother Albert Victor was being prepared for his future role as king. But life has a way of changing the best-laid plans. The news of his brother's death changed everything for George. George's path to the throne came at a time when the world was changing faster than ever before. The British Empire that George would one day rule was the largest in human history. At home in Britain, society was changing just as rapidly. George also lived in an era when royal families across Europe were all related to each other through marriage. The royal family that George inherited was proud of its traditions, but also somewhat out of touch with ordinary British people. George understood these challenges better than most people realized. His years in the Navy had taught him to read the winds and anticipate storms before they arrived. The young man who had never expected to be king began to prepare himself for a role that would demand everything he had to give. The story of how Prince George became the man who would save the British monarchy begins with salt water, rough seas, and the harsh discipline of naval life. When George was just 12 years old, his father made a decision that would shape everything about his future character. Instead of keeping his son safe in royal palaces with private tutors and gentle lessons, the Prince of Wales sent both George and his older brother Albert Victor to HMS Britannia, the Royal Navy's training ship. This was not the comfortable life that most royal children enjoyed. HMS Britannia was anchored in the cold waters off the coast of England, and life aboard was tough and demanding. The young princes had to wake up at dawn with all the other boys, scrub the decks, climb the rigging, and learn the skills that every sailor needed to survive at sea. There were no special privileges for being royal. If George failed to tie a knot properly or was slow to follow orders, he faced the same punishment as any common sailor's son. He was amazed by the different landscapes, from snow-capped mountains to endless grasslands where cattle roamed free. In the ports, he met people who spoke Spanish and Portuguese, expanding his understanding of the world beyond the English-speaking empire he had grown up knowing about. This was one of Britain's most important colonies, a vast continent that had been settled by British people, but was still largely unexplored and wild. George spent months in Australian waters, visiting Sydney, Melbourne, and other growing cities. This experience taught him that the British Empire was not a simple story of British people ruling over grateful subjects. Instead, he saw that empire was complicated, sometimes unfair, and often the source of conflict between different groups of people who all had legitimate claims to the land. He met Australian settlers who had carved out new lives in this distant land, and he began to understand the special relationship between Britain and its far-flung territories. For the next 3 years, from 1879 to 1882, the teenage prince experienced adventures that were beyond the imagination of most people in Victorian Britain. The ship sailed to Gibraltar, where George saw the great fortress that guarded the entrance to the Mediterranean Sea. In India, he saw ancient temples and bustling markets where merchants sold spices, silk, and precious stones. He witnessed the complex system by which a small number of British officials governed hundreds of millions of Indian people through local rulers and traditional customs. He had seen British settlers building new lives in distant lands, British merchants creating trade networks that spanned the globe, and British sailors maintaining the sea routes that held the empire together. During his brief periods at home between voyages, the old queen made sure to spend time with her grandson. She told him stories about the early days of her reign, the challenges she had faced, and the lessons she had learned about ruling. She had devoted her entire life to being queen, often at great personal cost. She impressed upon George that being royal was not about privilege and luxury, but about serving the people and the nation. These conversations planted seeds in George's mind about what it truly meant to wear the crown. He had also seen the challenges and problems that came with ruling such a vast and diverse collection of territories and peoples. In Hong Kong, he observed the busy port where goods from China were loaded onto ships bound for London. From there they traveled to the West Indies, where he experienced the tropical heat and learned about the sugar plantations that brought wealth to British merchants. The other boys on the ship came from ordinary families across Britain. He had the practical skills and common touch that came from working alongside ordinary sailors. But he also had the sense of duty and dedication that came from royal tradition. He understood both the deck of a warship and the drawing room of a palace. This rare combination would make him unlike any king who had come before him. He became an expert navigator, able to use the stars to find his way across empty oceans. He learned to read weather patterns and predict storms before they arrived. Most importantly, he learned how to command men in dangerous situations, earning their respect through competence and courage rather than royal privilege. Some were the sons of shopkeepers, others had fathers who worked in factories or on farms. For the first time in his life, George lived alongside people who had not been born into wealth and privilege. He learned their accents, heard their stories, and discovered what life was really like for most people in his grandmother's kingdom. He found peace in the endless horizon and the rhythm of waves against the ship's hull. The ocean taught him patience, as storms had to be endured rather than fought, taught him humility, as even the mightiest warship was small and vulnerable in the face of nature's power. These lessons would prove invaluable. When he later faced the storms of political crisis and world war, George thrived in this environment in a way that surprised everyone, including himself. While his brother Albert Victor struggled with the physical demands and strict discipline, George seemed to come alive. He was strong and athletic, quick to learn, and naturally good at leading other boys. His instructors noted that he had the makings of a fine naval officer. More importantly, he was developing qualities that would serve him well as a future king, though nobody knew it at the time. After completing his basic training, George was assigned to HMS Bacchante, a real warship that would take him on voyages around the world. The voyage continued to South America, where George saw the vast wilderness of countries like Argentina and Brazil. Perhaps the most important part of the journey was the long voyage to Australia. The ship also sailed to South Africa, where George witnessed the complex tensions between British colonists, Dutch settlers called Boers, and the native African peoples. During these long voyages, George learned practical skills that would serve him throughout his life. The young prince also developed a deep love for the sea itself. George's travels also exposed him to the incredible diversity of the British Empire. These experiences gave George something that no other member of the royal family possessed: a genuine understanding of what the empire meant to ordinary people. While George was learning about the world through direct experience, he was also receiving a different kind of education from his grandmother, Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria was particularly concerned about duty and dedication to public service. The combination of harsh naval training and royal instruction created something unique in George's character. The year 1892 brought tragedy and transformation to Prince George's life in ways he could never have imagined. His older brother Albert Victor, who had been destined to become king after their father, died suddenly from pneumonia in January. The death shocked the entire royal family and left them facing a crisis that went far beyond personal grief. Albert Victor had been engaged to marry Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, known to everyone as May, and the wedding had been planned for later that year. Princess May was 25 years old, intelligent, and well-educated. She came from a family with royal connections, but not great wealth. Her mother was a cousin of Queen Victoria, but her father was a minor German prince who had struggled with money problems throughout his life. Despite these challenges, May had grown up to be a remarkable young woman with a strong sense of duty and an impressive knowledge of royal traditions and responsibilities. As the new heir to the throne, George found himself spending more time at court and taking on responsibilities that had previously belonged to his brother. The old queen believed that royal marriages should be based on compatibility and shared values rather than just passion. She could see that George and May were well suited to each other and would make a strong partnership in facing the challenges of royal life. This brought him into frequent contact with May, and gradually they began to develop a friendship based on mutual respect and understanding. Both George and May were aware that some people might criticize their engagement, suggesting that May was simply being passed from one brother to another like a piece of property. They were determined to prove that their relationship was based on genuine affection and mutual choice, rather than mere convenience or duty. The proposal took place at Windsor Castle during a family gathering, and May accepted immediately. Their engagement was announced to great public interest and generally positive reaction. It was a relatively small ceremony by royal standards, partly out of respect for the recent death of Albert Victor. The birth of an heir was celebrated throughout the British Empire, and George took great pride in his new role as a father. May proved to be a devoted mother who took a close personal interest in her children's education and upbringing. The children were raised by nannies and tutors, but George and May made sure to spend regular time with them and to take an active interest in their development. George, drawing on his own experiences of naval training, believed that royal children should learn discipline, duty, and the importance of hard work. This meant undertaking official visits, attending state ceremonies, and learning about the complex political and constitutional issues that would one day be their responsibility to understand and navigate. Over the next several years, 5 more children followed: Prince Albert, Princess Mary, Prince Henry, Prince George, and Prince John, and partly because both George and May preferred simpler, more intimate celebrations. They had created a marriage based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection. This solid foundation would prove essential in the years ahead, as they faced challenges that would test not only their personal relationship, but also the very survival of the monarchy itself. Together, they were building the foundation for a new kind of royal family that would serve Britain through some of the most difficult and transformative years in its history. She had a natural dignity and grace that impressed everyone she met, and she quickly learned how to connect with people from all walks of life. Her intelligence and education made her a valuable advisor to George, and her calm, steady personality complemented his more emotional and sometimes impulsive nature. The bride wore a dress of white satin with a long train, and the groom wore his naval uniform with full decorations. Most people could see that the couple seemed genuinely happy together, and well-matched in temperament and interests. The sudden death of her left May in a difficult position. Royal engagements were not simply matters of the heart, but complex arrangements involving politics, family alliances, and public expectations. This journey took them to Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and South Africa, allowing them to see firsthand the vast territories and diverse peoples that would one day be under George's rule. The tour was a great success, with enthusiastic crowds greeting the royal couple wherever they went. The months following Albert Victor's death were painful and confusing for everyone involved. The royal family was in mourning. Wedding plans had to be cancelled, and May found herself uncertain about her future role in royal life. George and May settled into married life with apparent contentment and growing affection. They established their home at York Cottage on the Sandringham estate, a relatively modest house that reflected their preference for comfortable rather than grand living. The cottage became a place where they could relax away from the formality of court life and enjoy simple pleasures like gardening, reading, and spending time with family. During this period of grief and uncertainty, something unexpected began to happen between George and May. Both George and May were naturally shy people who took their duties seriously. They shared similar interests in history, art, and the traditions of royal life. George had traveled the world and could tell fascinating stories about distant lands and different cultures. May was well-read and could discuss books, politics, and social issues with intelligence and insight. Their conversations revealed that they had much more in common than anyone had initially realized. Queen Victoria, who had always taken a strong interest in the marriages of her grandchildren, watched the growing friendship between George and May with approval. The decision to marry was not made quickly or lightly. George proposed to May in May 1893, exactly 1 year after his brother's death. The wedding took place on July 6, 1893, at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace in London. The early years of their marriage proved that the decision to marry had been wise. Their first child, Prince Edward, was born in June 1894, just 11 months after their wedding. The growing family brought great joy to both parents, but they maintained a formal parenting style that was typical of royal families at the time. As George and May settled into their roles as parents and working members of the royal family, they also had to prepare for their future responsibilities as king and queen. One of their most significant early experiences was a tour of the British Empire that began in 1901. May proved to be an excellent partner for these official duties. The partnership between George and May was becoming one of the strongest in royal history. The early morning of May 6, 1910, changed everything for Prince George and his family. King Edward VII, George's father, had been feeling unwell for several days, but nobody expected what happened next. His father had been king for only 9 years, and George had expected to have decades to learn the complex art of ruling. Instead, he found himself thrust into the role during one of the most difficult periods in British history. The country was facing political crises that threatened to tear apart the very foundations of government. The king suddenly collapsed and died from a heart attack, leaving the throne to his son. At the age of 44, George Frederick Ernest Albert became King George V, ruler of the British Empire and one of the most powerful men on earth. For months before his father's death, the House of Lords had been locked in a bitter fight with the elected House of Commons over the people's budget. This budget proposed to tax the wealthy landowners who dominated the House of Lords, and they refused to approve it. The Liberal government, led by Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, wanted the king to create hundreds of new Liberal peers who would vote to limit the power of the House of Lords. Rather than taking dramatic action that might have solved the immediate problem but damaged the monarchy in the long run, he worked quietly behind the scenes to encourage compromise between the opposing sides. George had successfully navigated his first major political crisis without damaging the monarchy or taking sides in party politics. His careful constitutional approach established the pattern he would follow throughout his reign. He made it clear that he would create new peers if absolutely necessary. He had visited Ireland several times and had seen the poverty and resentment that fueled demands for independence. At the same time, he was aware that many people in Northern Ireland, particularly the Protestant community, were fiercely opposed to home rule and threatened to resist it by force if necessary. But he also urged both parties to find a solution that would preserve the dignity and effectiveness of parliamentary government. Women across Britain were demanding the right to vote, and some were willing to use violence to achieve their goals. Suffragettes chained themselves to railings, broke windows, and even set fire to buildings to draw attention to their cause. Conservative leaders warned that such action would destroy the balance of the Constitution and reduce the monarchy to a mere tool of whichever political party controlled the Commons. The ceremony at Westminster Abbey was magnificent, bringing together representatives from across the British Empire and demonstrating the pageantry and tradition that made the monarchy such a powerful symbol of national unity. George and Mary looked splendid in their coronation robes, and the ancient rituals reminded everyone of the continuity and stability that the monarchy represented. As a constitutional monarch, he could not publicly support any particular political position, but privately he was sympathetic to the women's cause. He met with Indian leaders who spoke eloquently about their desire for greater self-government and their frustration with British racial attitudes. He saw the poverty of ordinary Indians and began to understand that the empire could not be maintained forever through force and ceremony alone. New technologies were transforming society, old political systems were under pressure, and international tensions were rising. The alliance system that had maintained peace in Europe for decades was showing signs of strain, and military preparations were accelerating in all the major powers. This ceremony was even more elaborate than their London coronation. With hundreds of Indian princes paying homage to the British crown, the comfortable world of Victorian certainty was disappearing, and George would need all his wisdom, courage, and dedication to guide his kingdom through the storms ahead. The event was designed to demonstrate British power and the loyalty of Indian rulers to the empire. His own wife, Queen Mary, had shown him the intelligence and capability of women, and his naval experience had taught him to judge people by their abilities rather than their gender. The conflict had created a deadlock that paralyzed the government and threatened the entire system of parliamentary democracy. While maintaining strict political neutrality, he used his influence to encourage moderation on all sides. He met privately with Irish leaders, both nationalist and unionist, urging them to find peaceful solutions to their differences. He also worked to ensure that any solution would preserve the unity of his kingdom while respecting the legitimate aspirations of the Irish people. Ireland was demanding home rule, which would give the Irish people control over their own domestic affairs. While remaining part of the United Kingdom, this issue had divided British politics for decades, and was becoming more urgent as Irish nationalist politicians gained support in militant. George had always known this day would come, but he had hoped for many more years to prepare. The new king inherited a constitution that was under severe strain. Unlike his more flamboyant father, who had enjoyed the social aspects of kingship, George focused intensely on understanding his constitutional duties and responsibilities. He spent long hours studying precedents, consulting with legal experts, and carefully considering the long-term consequences of his decisions. George found himself caught in the middle of this constitutional crisis. The new king approached this challenge with the methodical determination that had served him well in the Navy. George's solution to the constitutional crisis revealed his political wisdom. The crisis was eventually resolved when the House of Lords agreed to pass the Parliament Act of 1911, which limited their power to block legislation passed by the House of Commons. But the constitutional crisis was not the only challenge facing the new king. George understood that the Irish question was not simply a political issue, but a matter that touched on fundamental questions about the nature of the United Kingdom and the British Empire. The king's approach to the Irish problem showed his growing skill as a constitutional monarch. Another major challenge facing George was the growing militancy of the women's suffrage movement. George found himself in a delicate position regarding women's suffrage. The king's coronation on June 22, 1911, provided a welcome break from these political tensions. Following the coronation, George and Mary embarked on a tour of India, where they were crowned Emperor and Empress of India in the spectacular Delhi Durbar. However, the Indian tours also opened George's eyes to the growing complexity of ruling the empire. As 1914 approached, George could sense that the world was changing rapidly. The king, who had never expected to rule, found himself preparing for challenges that no British monarch had ever faced before. The summer of 1914 began peacefully enough. But by August, the world had plunged into the most devastating war in human history. When Britain declared war on Germany on August 4, 1914, King George V faced a crisis that threatened not just his kingdom, but his very throne. The enemy his country now fought was the homeland of his own ancestors, and his family name itself was German. Never before had a British monarch faced such a personal and political challenge. The war that people thought would be over by Christmas stretched on month after month, year after year. Young men from across the British Empire marched off to fight in the muddy trenches of France and Belgium. Ships carrying supplies were sunk by German submarines in the Atlantic. Every morning he studied reports from the battlefields, reading about advances and retreats, victories and defeats. He visited munitions factories where women worked long hours making shells and bullets. Anti-German feeling in Britain was growing stronger every day. German submarines were sinking British ships and killing innocent civilians. Street riots broke out in London, with angry crowds attacking shops and businesses owned by people with German names. Some members of Parliament began questioning whether a king with a German name could truly represent Britain in its fight against Germany. His sons were serving in the military, facing the same dangers as other British families. His heart was completely with Britain and its allies, and he resented any suggestion that his German ancestry affected his loyalty to his adopted country. Newspapers printed harsh criticism of the royal family's foreign origins and suggested that their loyalty might be divided. German airships were bombing London. German armies were killing British soldiers by the thousands in France and Belgium. The British people were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about their royal family's German connections. It was a name that was unmistakably English, rooted in British soil and British history. With this single decision, George transformed his family from German princes who happened to rule Britain into a truly British royal dynasty. He gave up his position as a German duke and his membership in German military orders. Most dramatically, he required other members of the royal family to make similar changes. His German cousins, who held British titles, were forced to give them up and adopt English names and identities. He traveled to military hospitals to talk with wounded soldiers, listening to their stories and trying to offer comfort and encouragement. At home, families worried about their sons, husbands, and brothers who were fighting thousands of miles away. But the Kaiser's joke only highlighted how completely George had outmaneuvered his critics. By making himself more British, George had ensured that his dynasty would survive and thrive long after the war ended. The British king had given up his German heritage to become more British than many of his subjects. He had saved the monarchy by transforming it, creating a new royal house that would endure for generations to come. Newspapers that had been critical of the royal family now praised the king's patriotic decision. Politicians who had questioned the monarchy's loyalty now declared their complete support. The simple act of changing a name had transformed their political situation and secured the throne's position during the nation's greatest crisis. On July 17, 1917, he issued a royal proclamation that shocked the entire British establishment. With the stroke of a pen, he abolished the ancient royal house of Saxe-Coburg and created an entirely new dynasty, the House of Windsor. The entire nation was focused on one goal: winning the war against Germany. It represented a fundamental transformation in how the British monarchy saw itself and its relationship to the nation. Previous royal families had been international dynasties that happened to rule Britain. The House of Windsor was created specifically to be British, with its identity completely tied to the British people and their interests. These visits were dangerous, as German artillery could strike at any moment, but George insisted on seeing the conditions his soldiers faced. He walked through the muddy trenches, talked with officers and enlisted men alike, and showed that he shared their hardships and dangers. Some suggested that he publicly renounce his German relatives and denounce the German war effort in harsh terms. Others recommended that he make grand gestures like renaming royal residences with more English names or dismissing any servants who had German backgrounds. The troops were impressed by their king's courage and genuine concern for their welfare. George threw himself into the war effort with total dedication. George was reviewing troops when his horse suddenly reared up and fell backward, crushing the king beneath its weight. The accident left George with severe injuries to his pelvis and caused him chronic pain for the rest of his life. Despite his injuries, he refused to reduce his war activities, and continued to visit troops and factories while walking with great difficulty and constant discomfort. The king made frequent trips to France to visit British troops in the trenches. During one of these visits in 1915, disaster struck. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the political and personal crisis that was building around the royal family. The situation became even more difficult as the war continued. George felt this criticism deeply. He'd spent his entire adult life serving Britain, first in the Navy and then as king. The king's advisors urged him to take dramatic action to demonstrate his British identity. George considered all these suggestions, but his solution was far more bold and decisive than anyone expected. The name Windsor came from Windsor Castle, the ancient fortress that had been a royal residence for nearly 1,000 years. The change was not just symbolic. George also renounced all German titles and honors for himself and his family. The announcement of the new House of Windsor was met with tremendous enthusiasm by the British public. The German Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was George's cousin, reportedly mocked the decision by saying he looked forward to seeing a performance of Shakespeare's play The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. The creation of the House of Windsor was more than just a wartime political move. This decision also demonstrated George's remarkable political instincts. While other European monarchies were collapsing under the pressure of war and revolution, the British throne became stronger and more secure. The Great War was far from over, but King George V had already won his most important victory. As the Great War dragged on into 1917 and 1918, King George V watched in horror as the world he had grown up in began to crumble. Across Europe, ancient royal houses that had ruled for centuries were falling like dominoes. Revolution was spreading from country to country, and kings who had once seemed untouchable were being overthrown, exiled, or worse. For George, these were not just political events happening to strangers. These were his relatives, his cousins, people he had known since childhood. They wanted him to send British ships to rescue Nicholas and his family, to give them safe passage to Britain, where they could live in exile. This request put George in the most difficult position of his life. His heart told him to help his cousin and childhood friend, but his head warned him of the enormous political dangers. They argued that the Russian Tsar was extremely unpopular in Britain, because Russia had performed so poorly in the war. Many British people blamed Russian military failures for prolonging the conflict and increasing British casualties. Bringing Nicholas to Britain might provoke riots and demonstrations that could destabilize George's own throne. Bolshevik revolutionaries murdered Nicholas Alexandra and all 5 of their children in a basement in the Russian city of Ekaterinburg. When George learned of their deaths, he was devastated. In Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II, another of George's cousins, was forced to flee to Holland when his army collapsed and revolutions spread through German cities. The German Empire that had threatened Britain for 4 years simply ceased to exist, and Wilhelm spent the rest of his life in bitter exile. He had saved his own throne, but at the cost of his cousin S.'s life and the lives of 5 innocent children. The most shocking collapse came in Russia, where Tsar Nicholas II had ruled over the largest country in the world. His decision to create the House of Windsor and make the British royal family more British had worked perfectly. While other monarchies collapsed because they seemed foreign and out of touch with their people, the British throne grew stronger because George had made it genuinely national rather than international. The old system where royal families were all related to each other and married each other across national boundaries was no longer sustainable. In an age of nationalism and democracy, people wanted their kings and queens to belong to them completely, not to some international royal club. Britain had won the greatest victory in its history, and the king who had led the nation through its darkest hours was more popular than ever. The British people saw him as their king, not as a foreign prince who happened to rule them. He had saved his throne by sacrificing his family relationships and his personal feelings. The guilt over abandoning Nicholas haunted him for years. He had chosen duty over emotion, his kingdom over his kindness, and the crown over his conscience. Nicholas was not just George's cousin, but looked so much like him that people often mistook them for twins when they appeared together at family gatherings. George had positioned the British monarchy perfectly for the new world that was emerging from the war. The House of Windsor was not German or Russian or Austrian. It was British through and through, and that made all the difference. He quietly let it be known that the Russian royal family would not be welcome in Britain. This decision sealed the fate of Nicholas and his family. Without British protection, they had nowhere to go and no way to escape Russia. Millions of young men were fighting and dying in the trenches. Families at home were struggling with food shortages and economic hardship. The last thing the country needed was the additional burden and controversy of housing the deposed Russian royal family. Many of the old certainties were gone, traditional authorities were being questioned, and new political ideas were spreading rapidly. George had successfully navigated this transformation, but even greater challenges lay ahead. The House of Windsor had survived its first great test, but the king who had created it would soon face new trials that would test every lesson he had learned about leadership, duty, and the art of survival. Emperor Karl was forced to give up his throne, and the vast empire was broken up into several new countries. The Austro-Hungarian Empire that had once been one of Europe's great powers became nothing more than a memory. They had the same beard, the same height, and such similar faces that even their own relatives sometimes confused them from a distance. In March 1917, just 4 months before George created the House of Windsor, revolution erupted in Russia. The Russian people, exhausted by years of war, military defeats, and economic collapse, rose up against their Tsar. In Spain, King Alfonso XIII faced strikes, riots, and republican movements that demanded the end of the monarchy. In Italy, the royal family struggled with political chaos and the rise of new radical movements that wanted to overthrow all the old institutions. Nicholas was forced to give up his throne and was placed under house arrest with his wife Alexandra and their 5 children. The mighty Russian Empire that had dominated Eastern Europe for centuries simply disappeared in a matter of days. George received desperate telegrams from his Russian relatives begging for help. Britain was fighting for its life against Germany, and the British people were making tremendous sacrifices for the war effort. George's advisors were firmly opposed to giving sanctuary to Nicholas. After agonizing over the decision for weeks, George made the choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The consequences were horrific. In July 1918, as George was celebrating the success of his new Windsor identity and the approaching end of the war, the Russian tragedy was not an isolated event. All across Europe, royal families were falling. In Austria-Hungary, ancient Habsburg dynasty that had ruled for over 600 years was swept away by revolution and military defeat. Even countries that won the war saw their royal families threatened. George watched all these events with growing amazement and relief. The key to George's success was his understanding of how the world was changing. By giving up his German heritage and cutting ties with his foreign relatives, the end of the war in November 1918 found George in a remarkably strong position. But George's success came at a personal cost that few people understood. The world that emerged from the Great War was very different from the one that had existed before 1914. The end of the Great War in 1918 brought victory to Britain, but it also brought massive changes that threatened everything King George V had worked to build. Millions of soldiers were returning home to find a country very different from the one they had left. The war had cost enormous amounts of money, leaving the government deep in debt. Factories that had produced weapons and ammunition were closing down, putting thousands of people out of work. Most importantly, the British people had different expectations about their government and their king than they had before the war. George understood that he could not simply return to the old ways of being royal. The war had changed everything, and he needed to change with it. The king, who had saved his throne by making it more British, now faced the challenge of making it more connected to ordinary people. Coal miners, railway workers, dock workers, and many others walked off their jobs, bringing the entire country to a standstill. No trains ran, no ships moved cargo, and many businesses were forced to close. He could not simply command people to obey, as kings had done in the past. Instead, he had to use his moral authority and personal influence to help bring people together and find solutions to difficult problems. The government declared a state of emergency and called in soldiers to keep essential services running. This would require him to break centuries of royal tradition and create entirely new ways of being a monarch. In 1932, he became the first British monarch to broadcast on the radio. Speaking to millions of families in their own homes on Christmas Day, this first Christmas broadcast was heard not just in Britain, but across the entire British Empire, from Canada to Australia to India to South Africa. For the first time, ordinary families could hear their king speaking to them personally, sharing his thoughts about the challenges facing the nation and expressing his hopes for the future. The broadcasts made George feel like a member of every family rather than a distant figure in a palace. Every year, families would gather around their radios on Christmas afternoon to hear what their king had to say. Her dignified presence and genuine interest in people's lives complemented George's more informal approach. Together, they visited hospitals, schools, factories, and community centers, always showing sincere concern for the people they met. They simplified royal ceremonies, reduced the number of servants and courtiers, and lived more modestly than previous generations of royalty. They sent their children to schools where they mixed with children from ordinary families, rather than keeping them isolated with private tutors and royal palaces. Mary had a particular gift for talking with women and children, and her warmth and intelligence impressed everyone she encountered. His messages were simple, direct, and filled with genuine concern for his people's welfare. When economic depression hit Britain in the early 1930s, George took a voluntary pay cut to show solidarity with families who were struggling financially. When natural disasters struck parts of the empire, he was among the first to offer help and encouragement to the victims. He saw his role as working for his people rather than ruling over them. This fundamental shift in attitude was reflected in everything he did. From his daily schedule of meetings and visits, to his careful attention to public opinion and social problems, he had proven that ancient institutions could adapt to modern times without losing their essential meaning and purpose. The House of Windsor that George had created was not just surviving but thriving, more popular and secure than the monarchy had been for generations. He spoke about unemployment, poverty, and other problems that affected ordinary families, showing that he understood and cared about their struggles. He had transformed the British monarchy from an ancient institution that seemed increasingly irrelevant to modern life into something that felt essential to the nation's identity and unity. People saw him not as a relic of the past, but as a symbol of British values and character. The first major test came in 1926, during the general strike. When millions of workers across Britain stopped working to demand better wages and conditions, George found himself in an extremely delicate position. As king, he had to remain neutral in political disputes. But he also had a responsibility to help maintain peace and order in his kingdom. This was almost unthinkable behavior for previous monarchs, who had maintained strict distance from their subjects. George's willingness to mingle with ordinary people showed that he saw himself as their servant rather than their master. The strike leaders demanded that he support the workers, while government ministers wanted him to condemn the strikers as dangerous revolutionaries who were threatening democracy. He worked quietly behind the scenes to encourage both the government and the strike leaders to find a peaceful solution. He met privately with politicians from all parties, urging them to show restraint and avoid violence. He made it clear that he supported the right of workers to organize and demand fair treatment. But he also emphasized the need to resolve disputes through negotiation rather than confrontation. Instead of taking either side, George chose a different approach that showed his growing political wisdom. The king's approach during the general strike demonstrated his understanding of how monarchy had to change in the modern world. But George's most revolutionary innovation was his use of new technology to connect directly with his people. The king's voice, speaking directly into people's living rooms, created a completely new kind of relationship between the monarch and his subjects. George's Christmas broadcasts became one of the most popular traditions in Britain and the Empire. The king also revolutionized royal public appearances by introducing the royal walkabout, where he would leave his official car and walk among crowds of people, shaking hands and talking with individuals. Queen Mary proved to be an invaluable partner in these efforts to modernize the monarchy. The royal couple also changed the way the royal family lived and behaved. George's approach to being king was based on service rather than privilege. The king's success in connecting with ordinary people was perhaps most visible during times of crisis. By the mid-1930s, George had achieved something remarkable. The king, who had never expected to rule, had created a new model of monarchy that emphasized duty, service, and connection with the people. But even as George was succeeding in his mission to modernize the monarchy, storm clouds were gathering within his own family that would soon test everything he had built. By the early 1930s, King George V had successfully transformed the British monarchy and made it more beloved than it had been for generations. But even as he was winning the hearts of millions of his subjects, the king was facing his greatest personal crisis. The problem lay not with his political enemies or foreign threats, but within his own family. His eldest son and heir, Edward, Prince of Wales, was becoming everything that George had worked his entire life to avoid being. Prince Edward was handsome, charming, and popular with the public, especially young people who admired his modern style and relaxed approach to royal duties. He dressed fashionably, enjoyed nightclub parties, and seemed more interested in having fun than in preparing to be king. At first, many people saw this as a refreshing change from the more formal royal traditions, but George watched his son's behavior with growing alarm and disappointment. He had shown them by example that being royal meant putting the needs of the country before personal desires and working tirelessly for the welfare of their subjects. Edward seemed to have learned none of these lessons. Instead, he appeared to view his royal status as an opportunity for pleasure and privilege rather than responsibility. The prince had a series of affairs with married women, behavior that shocked the conservative moral standards of the time and threatened to damage the reputation of the royal family. He arranged private meetings where he explained the importance of royal duty and the need to maintain the dignity of the crown. He warned Edward that his behavior was damaging the monarchy and could threaten the future of the House of Windsor that George had worked so hard to create. But these conversations seemed to have little effect on the prince, who continued his reckless lifestyle. George had worked hard to make the monarchy respectable and family-oriented, but his son's scandals threatened to undo all that progress. Edward became completely infatuated with Mrs. Simpson and began appearing with her in public, ignoring the scandal this created. He had survived the Great War, the collapse of other European monarchies, economic depression, and political upheaval. But the thought of his son destroying everything he had built was almost too much to bear. George began telling his close advisors that he feared Edward would ruin himself and the monarchy within a year of becoming king. The British press, out of respect for the royal family, did not report on the relationship. But rumors spread throughout London society and eventually reached newspapers in other countries. During the Jubilee celebrations, Edward appeared bored and distracted, more interested in getting back to Mrs. Simpson than in acknowledging the cheers of the crowds. George watched his heir's behavior with growing despair. Knowing that this man would soon inherit the throne he had spent his life serving and protecting. The woman was not only a foreigner, but also a divorced person who was still married to her second husband. The celebrations were extraordinary, with millions of people lining the streets of London to cheer their king and queen. Years of chronic pain from his wartime injury, combined with the stress of family problems and royal duties, were taking their toll. He developed severe lung problems and began having difficulty breathing. He arranged meetings between his son and senior government ministers, hoping that contact with serious political leaders might make Edward understand the weight of royal responsibility. He also tried to convince Edward to end his relationship with Mrs. Simpson before it created a constitutional crisis. Edward remained devoted to Mrs. Simpson and seemed indifferent to the problems this would cause. He appeared to believe that he could simply change the rules and traditions of monarchy to suit his personal desires, not understanding that the crown's power came from respecting those very traditions and rules. His doctors were concerned, but George continued to work, determined to fulfill his duties as long as possible. Now that great achievement would be tested by his own son, whose reign would prove George's fears tragically correct. The public response surprised even George, who had always been modest about his popularity. The enthusiasm of the crowds showed how successfully he had connected with his people and made the monarchy genuinely beloved, according to the laws and traditions of both the British government and the Church of England. It would be impossible for Edward to marry her and remain king. His last words, according to those present, were about his duty to his people. Even in death, he was thinking about his responsibilities as king rather than his personal feelings or family relationships. The monarch was required to be the head of the Church of England, which did not recognize divorce and would not perform marriage ceremonies for divorced people. He spent most of his time at Sandringham, the royal estate where he had always been happiest, surrounded by the countryside he loved. Queen Mary rarely left his side, and together they watched as their life's work faced its greatest threat from within their own family. The king had spent decades teaching his children about duty, service, and dedication to the British people. Edward's romantic relationships were particularly troubling to his father. The situation became even more serious when Edward began showing sympathy for fascist ideas that were spreading across Europe. The prince made admiring comments about Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in Germany, suggesting that their strong leadership might be good for Britain as well. This horrified George, who understood that such political statements by the heir to the throne could drag the monarchy into dangerous controversies. George tried repeatedly to talk with his son about these problems. The final crisis began in 1934 when Edward met Wallis Simpson, an American woman who was married to a British businessman. George was deeply troubled by his son's relationship with Mrs. Simpson. The king's health began to deteriorate rapidly as he worried about the constitutional crisis that was building. In 1935, Britain celebrated George's Silver Jubilee, marking 25 years of his reign. But even this triumph was overshadowed by George's concerns about his son. The king's physical health was failing along with his spirits. In his final months, George made desperate attempts to prepare Edward for kingship. These efforts failed completely. As 1935 turned to 1936, George's condition worsened rapidly. On January 20th, 1936, King George V died peacefully at Sandringham. The man who had never expected to be king had ruled for over 25 years, transforming the monarchy and creating the House of Windsor. The death of King George V on January 20th, 1936, marked the end of one of the most remarkable reigns in British history. But it was only the beginning of a legacy that would shape the monarchy for generations to come. Within hours of his father's death, Edward became King Edward VIII, and George's worst fears about his son began to come true with shocking speed. Just as George had predicted, his eldest son destroyed his own kingship within a year. The constitutional crisis over Edward's determination to marry Wallis Simpson paralyzed the government and threatened to tear apart the British Empire. When Edward finally chose love over duty and abdicated the throne in December 1936, he proved that his father's concerns had been completely justified. Edward's reign lasted exactly 325 days, less than 11 months. When Edward gave up the crown, it passed to his younger brother Albert, who became King George VI. Albert had been trained in the same traditions of duty and service that his father had embodied. She used television and later the internet to speak directly to her people. Just as George had used radio in the 1930s, she traveled constantly throughout Britain and the Commonwealth, meeting ordinary people and showing genuine interest in their lives. She maintained the balance between dignity and accessibility that George had pioneered, always remembering that the monarchy existed to serve the people rather than to rule over them. Unlike Edward, he understood that being king meant putting the needs of the nation before personal desires and working tirelessly for the welfare of the people. During World War II, the royal family represented everything that Britain was fighting to preserve. They embodied the values of courage, determination, and democratic freedom that distinguished Britain from the fascist dictatorships threatening Europe. Royal families that tried to maintain absolute power or remained isolated from their people were overthrown by revolutions or gradually lost their relevance. The House of Windsor survived and prospered because George had made it responsive to democratic values and genuinely connected to the lives of ordinary people. Members of the House of Windsor became patrons of charities, advocates for important causes, and champions of people who needed help. Prince Charles, who later became King Charles III, devoted much of his life to environmental protection and helping disadvantaged young people. Prince William and his wife Catherine continued this tradition by focusing on mental health issues and support for military veterans. As British society became more diverse and democratic throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, the monarchy adapted while maintaining its essential character. The royal family embraced multiculturalism, supported social progress, and showed that ancient institutions could remain relevant in modern times. Countries that kept their royal families after World War II studied the British example and adopted similar approaches based on service, duty, and connection with ordinary citizens. When scandals or controversies arose, they dealt with them by acknowledging mistakes, making necessary changes, and recommitting themselves to their duties. He built a new kind of monarchy based on service, sacrifice, and genuine care for the people. The House of Windsor stands as George V's greatest achievement, proof that even the oldest institutions can adapt, survive. His legacy lives on in every public appearance by his descendants, every charitable work they undertake, and every moment when they choose duty over personal desire. The unexpected king who saved the monarchy by making it more humble created a model of leadership that continues to inspire people around the world and thrive when they are guided by wisdom, dedication, and love for the people they serve. This approach, based on humility and service rather than pride and privilege, helped the monarchy maintain public support even during difficult periods. Instead of ruling over distant territories by force, the British Crown became a voluntary association of independent countries that chose to maintain their connection to the monarchy. Countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand kept the British monarch as their head of state because they saw the crown as representing their own values and traditions, not as a symbol of foreign domination. The current royal family still emphasizes duty over privilege, service over ceremony, and connection with ordinary people over isolation in palaces. They still use modern technology to communicate directly with the public, just as George used radio to speak to families in their homes. The Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, and Dutch royal families all followed patterns that George V had established, proving that monarchy could survive and thrive in democratic societies. But George's true wisdom was revealed in what happened next. George VI faced the greatest test any British monarch had ever confronted. When World War II began in 1939, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany threatened to destroy everything that Britain stood for, and the royal family became symbols of national resistance and determination. Throughout the war, George VI and his wife Elizabeth refused to leave London, even when German bombs were falling on the city. She served in the military during the war, working as a mechanic and driver, showing that even princesses had responsibilities to their country. When she became queen in 1952, she continued the traditions that George V had established, making the monarchy a symbol of stability, continuity, and national unity. They visited bombed neighborhoods, comforted grieving families, and showed that the royal family shared the dangers and hardships of ordinary people. The king's daughter, Princess Elizabeth, who would later become Queen Elizabeth II, learned the same lessons about duty and service that her grandfather, George V, had taught. Elizabeth II's long reign, which lasted over 70 years, proved the lasting value of George V's innovations. The House of Windsor that George created became a model for constitutional monarchies around the world. Perhaps most importantly, George V's transformation of the monarchy from a German royal house to a genuinely British institution created a sense of national identity that helped Britain survive its greatest challenges. The Commonwealth of Nations, which grew out of the British Empire, also reflected George V's vision of the monarchy. George's understanding that monarchy had to earn respect rather than demand it proved prophetic as the 20th century progressed. The king's emphasis on duty and service also influenced how the royal family approached social problems. Even the way the royal family handled crises reflected George V's wisdom. George V's creation of the House of Windsor also proved its strength during times of social change. Today, nearly a century after George V's death, the House of Windsor continues to embody the principles he established. The king, who never expected to rule, created something far more lasting than any monument or building. King George V transformed not just a royal house, but the very idea of what it means to be royal in the modern world.